The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there.
Welcome to Unraveling. This is a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist.
And I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
And we have a really great episode for you today. And Kurt, I know you were quite excited about the person that you got to interview.
Yes, I'm kind of out of my gourd excited about it, actually. I'm not, I really geek out. As I say at the beginning, I'm a social worker and psychotherapist, but there's another lifetime where I'm a researcher in things like developmental biology, evolutionary genetics, and things like that. And so, we've been doing some episodes on that.
Yeah.
And I really had the hope that we could get our guest today on the program to talk about critical periods, what these are and how they work and what her research is.
And critical periods are these times when there's more plasticity in the brain and when it's more sensitive and receptive to learning new things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, sometimes we think about the DNA is our genetic code, but then there's things that influence that. But maybe people who are not in the know don't necessarily think that sometimes there are particular windows of time when certain things have to develop, have the opportunity to develop, where our minds have very particular kinds of neuroplasticity that open and close. It's sort of like a formula, but it has to interact with the environment. How do they work? Could we ever use them for therapeutic benefit? That's the kind of stuff we're going to get into today.
Yeah, because it was once thought that when these critical periods ended, that was it.
That was it,
Maybe
right?
That's not the case.
That's right. And that's what we're going to hear her talk about today. Dr. Gül Dölen, MD, PhD, is the professor and Renee and Bob Parsons Endowed Chair in the Departments of Neuroscience and Psychology, the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute, and the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics at the University of California, Berkeley. She's the director of the Fathom Project, maintains a series of other academic affiliations at other major universities. She is widely recognized to be a pioneer and world leader in psychedelics research, having discovered a number of very important things about how psychedelics and critical periods work together.
And we hope you enjoy our conversation with Gül Dölen.
Well, Dr. Dölen, thank you so very much for joining us on Unraveling.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So my hope today was that we could talk about some of your research and discoveries, which have been really interesting and exciting to me ever since I've heard about them. Now, I'm interested especially in this sort of idea of critical periods, and I was hoping you'd be a person who could explain that to us. Could you tell us, for someone that knows nothing about it, what is a critical period in development or in brain development?
Yeah, so just a formal definition, it's a period of time when the brain is much more sensitive to its environment and able to learn from its environment in a heightened way. So a critical period for language, mostly people are thinking about speech. So your ability to produce the sounds that are sort of the phonemes for the language that you are speaking is considered a hard critical period. Whereas the ability to learn a new language is more like a sensitive period because you can learn a new language as an adult. It's just much harder. You're much less fluid. You always have an accent. And so some people make that distinction between sensitive and critical periods. The first description of a critical period was actually imprinting behavior in gray-lag geese, and it was Konrad Lorenz who described it back in 1935, actually. So the concept has really been around for almost 100 years. And since his first description of imprinting behavior in geese, we've discovered critical periods in a bunch of different species, in mice, in rats, and cats, and ferrets, and humans, in songbirds. And we've discovered all kinds of different critical periods that regulate things like the formation of the visual system and the somatosensory system, the motor system. And my lab has really focused on a critical period for social behavior, which we discovered.
Yeah. And what is the critical period for social learning that you discovered?
Yeah. So the way we measure it, we're measuring it in mice, and we're using an assay called the conditioned place preference assay, which allows us to test the ability to learn an association between a cue and a context. And so in this case, we're using bedding because mice are, olfactory specialists, and it allows them to recognize the cues and distinguish them. And we're comparing the condition of isolation condition or social condition. And what we found is that in juvenile animals, so the equivalent of around puberty in humans, the mice are able to learn this association between bedding and social really, really well. But as they get older, that ability to learn the association goes away. And so the way that I sort of relate it to people who are focused on humans is that this is probably the type of social reward learning, is the type of learning that teenagers are very good at. So they're very sensitive to peer pressure because they're wide open in terms of learning from their social environment. And they're paying a lot of attention to exactly, what color jeans the popular girls are wearing, or, what are the rules of hierarchy, who's the cool kid in school, who's the prom queen, who's the, all of these things. But by the time we get to adulthood, those things are less important to us. We get more comfortable in who we are as we are, and we wear mom jeans because they're comfortable, not, we're not so worried about impressing in that way.
I think social phenomena are always a little more complex, aren't they? I mean, maybe that's why maybe people hadn't found or thought to look for, I don't know if they were looking or not, for critical periods in this area before you discovered it. But maybe an example from a sort of maybe classic sensory issue. I think you had once described like in vision development of how it works exactly. How does time affect the way that something develops?
Yeah. So the vast, vast majority of what we know about critical periods and their mechanisms come from studies of the visual system. So the first description of this critical period was around the ability of the visual cortex to change its response properties following a deprivation. So if you monocularly deprive an eye for about 2 to 3 days, typically the way the experiments are done, then the circuits will become rearranged in the visual cortex. And now the neurons that were responding to the eye that was closed, their response properties go down, and the eye that stayed open, those response properties go up. So that change is called ocular dominance plasticity. And just like, other critical periods, the ability to induce ocular dominance plasticity by this manipulation is highest in juveniles. And by the time the animals reach adulthood, it goes away. And this has clinical consequences because, for example, if you are born with cataracts in both eyes, if you don't have them removed by the time you're about 4 or 5 years old, then you will always be blind, even if you have the cataracts removed, because that critical period for structuring the visual system, the ability to process that visual information, once it's closed, even if you remove the impediment to, visual information coming into the brain, once that rearrangement is locked in, it can't adjust to the now normalized world.
So, essentially, in a way, the, development anticipates certain sorts of stimuli and experiences at different points in time. And if we don't get those, then actually the brain doesn't develop in the sort of optimal or expected, anticipated way that evolution has crafted for us. Is that right?
That's right. That's a great way of putting it. The other way of thinking about it is that, the reason that we have critical periods is because there aren't enough genes in the genome to encode every single behavior. Instead, what gets encoded in the genome is the ability to learn from your environment. And this ability to learn, it has a progression, right? So you can't learn everything all at once. Instead, you have to learn to walk and then or crawl and then walk and then run, right? And so those windows of time seem to be developmentally constrained to the appropriate window for that learning progression. But it also means that it enables humans and other animals who have these critical periods a huge amount of behavioral flexibility that wouldn't be available if they were trying to use genes to encode these behaviors. So instead of having 7,000 possible languages, we would all speak only one, right? And so this is an advantage, but also a constraint that is imposed by setting the brain up like this.
And I think it's quite interesting. I think outside the world of perhaps professionals researching this, or maybe those associated at the edges of it for clinical reasons, for example, maybe people don't fully appreciate the impact of those developmental markers in it, and how permanent they can be on all kinds of systems in the body and the brain, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I've given examples of things that are easy to relate to clinically, but I would also say that like your personality develops during this point. I think there are critical periods for motor learning. So the way you walk, the way you hold your body, the way that you, react to certain stimuli, fearful or loving, all of these things. Once your critical periods have closed, they get sort of locked in. William James has a famous quote that I'm paraphrasing. It says something like, if people could understand how quickly they would become a mere bundle of walking habits, they would pay more attention to their behaviors during the plastic state. I think he intuitively understood that plasticity relates, and the change in plasticity across development, the change in the ability to induce plasticity, which we now call metaplasticity, that he intuited as, being so important for the development of the brain and our habits and learning, and the circuits that encode, vision, encode behavior.
Are there ever ways that the brain itself re-unlocks a critical period state?
Yeah. So we think that, habits get a really bad rap, but they're actually very adaptive. They allow us to navigate our world efficiently and productively, and without having to, exert a huge amount of emotional energy that we can, therefore devote to other things. But they are really most useful so long as your environment is really, really stable. But when there are radical shifts in the environment, then those learned habits of behavior are not necessarily adaptive anymore. So we think that this ability to reopen critical periods is something that's built in whenever there's a radical shift in the environment. And I think that we have evidence, not from, a little bit from our lab, but mostly from the literature, that, the old way of being able to reopen critical periods was through deprivation experiments. So if you, visually deprive a mouse or even a human for, 2 weeks, then you can reopen that critical period. And we think that religious practices like mystical traditions have been using this insight into deprivation, being able to induce open states of critical periods, for centuries, to be able to, have epiphanies. We think, this is what people are doing when they go and live in a cave for a month, or they go on a silent retreat, or they join a monastery and deprive themselves of their normal daily activities and social interactions. They are essentially radically altering their environment And that is causing the brain to say, wait a minute, something is off. All the sort of statistics of our inputs aren't coming in the same way. Reset, reset, reset. The analogy I give is something like, if you're on a Zoom call and the screen starts to flicker, maybe you don't do anything with a few flickers, but if it freezes and it freezes for a couple of seconds, then you hit the reset button. In terms of evolutionary selection pressures that would enable this, I think, humans live a long time. And during the course of their life, things change. So, hierarchical relationships, are one thing when you're a juvenile, another thing when you are a young adult. And then at some point, the elders start dying and your parents die. And now suddenly you are required to take that position in the hierarchy that, used to be your elders, and now you're the elder. And so being able to adjust to those radical shifts and to now take on the behaviors of somebody who's at a different position in the hierarchy, I think that's enabled by this flexibility that happens when we have major life events.
That's really interesting. It actually gives me goosebumps. I hadn't even considered most of those examples in that way, and I didn't know that about deprivation. That's kind of amazing, actually. It happens after a stroke, too, doesn't it? It's things like that.
Yeah. So right after a stroke, for about 2 months after you've had the stroke, that window of the critical period reopens. And in some sense, the stroke is like an extreme deprivation experiment, right? Like you're used to having inputs coming in. Let's say you had a stroke that affected your arm, and now those arm movement inputs are not coming in. And so that tells the brain something's off, reset. And we think, nearby brain regions become plastic again, and it enables them to learn how to do the functions that used to belong to the jaw, but now are sort of repurposed for our movements.
And it's sometimes it's felt to me as a therapist almost a little unfair how much happens in the very earliest period of life, right? Because although it's a very flexible system, as my mentors in developmental psychology used to say, right? Like actually a lot can go wrong and people are still basically okay. But when things do happen, they can sometimes have a much longer lasting impact, can't they?
That's right. And I think that the frustration that you're pointing to is one that, not just therapists, but psychiatrists, neurologists, have shared. And this is why, in the field of neuroscience, there are, 3 Nobel Prizes given for critical periods, 7,000 papers written about the mechanisms underlying critical periods, because people who share your frustration have been hoping that we might someday discover a master key for unlocking critical periods that would allow us to go back and tinker with the things that didn't quite get learned in the optimal way.
Well, I know that's just right where your research is, and being able to open these periods and to get into this plastic state, a very special kind of plastic state at will, would be of obvious, enormous benefit to medicine, for example, and maybe to humanity more broadly, but certainly to medicine, right?
Right.
Did you ever imagine that there would be like a medicine or a drug that might be able to help with reopening critical periods? It sounds like it's a relatively extreme states that have allowed for this in other arenas.
Yeah, so the existing sort of deprivation-based critical period reopening methods, are not terribly therapeutically useful. Nobody wants to cure their stroke by having another stroke, right? So it's just not a useful way of doing it. And so, people have been looking for these master keys. And honestly, when I was a graduate student, I poo-pooed the idea. I was very skeptical that we would ever get to a master key, because based on what we knew about the mechanisms relating to inhibitory excitatory balance, extracellular matrix remodeling, metaplasticity, I thought anything that could do this, any drug or manipulation that could be a master key for unlocking critical periods, would dramatically interfere with the ability of the brain to, not have seizures, or it would, cause amnesia, or it would cause, structural instability to the brain. And so I was very, very skeptical of the idea that we might ever find a master key.
Yeah, and a master key, again, just being something that could open critical periods kind of at will, and presumably without the risk that they don't close again, or that they have some problem like you described. Is
That's
that
right. That's right.
And so it turns out you ended up discovering that there's just such a master key also,
That's
right?
Yeah.
I mean, please tell me about that. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So we, the way we kind of came on the fact that psychedelics turn out to be this master key that we've been looking for was a little bit serendipitous. First, my lab was studying social behaviors. That's really the main focus of the lab, is social behaviors. And we knew that there was one specific type of psychedelic that was in the category called an empathogenic psychedelic, and this was MDMA. So MDMA is known by its other names as ecstasy. It's an empathogen, so it induces a lot of sort of pro-social behaviors in humans, and actually we also showed it in octopuses and rodents. So it's a very pro-social psychedelic, and people who are using MDMA will report interest in being part of 30-person cuddle puddles at
You want to connect with others. You'll feel good
feel
about
good
being
around being others. You want to touch people. You want to understand their emotions. You're very sensitive to what they're feeling. And so we thought, well, if we're going to reopen this critical period, MDMA, because it has this pro-social property, might be just the one. And so we gave MDMA to our mice in adulthood when the critical period was already closed. And then we measured 2 days later. So we weren't after the sort of acute subjective effects of MDMA. We wanted to know what happened 48 hours later after the MDMA had worn off. What did that do to the social reward learning? And what we discovered is that it brought social reward learning back. And so suddenly these adults were able to learn from their social environment in the same way that juveniles do. And when we ended that paper, so that was a paper that we published in 2019 in Nature, we kind of finished that paper by saying, okay, we figured out why MDMA is so therapeutically useful for PTSD, and it's basically enabling this social interaction that allows for the therapeutic alliance between the person who's being treated and the therapist. We knew already that there was a little bit of a problem with that interpretation, which was the fact that when we gave MDMA in a social context, we were able to reopen this social critical period. But if we gave MDMA in an isolation context, then suddenly we weren't able to reopen this critical period. So what it suggested, that result was, first of all, it was satisfying because it provided an explanation for why the therapeutic context matters so much. I always joke that you can't take MDMA and go to a rave and expect to cure your PTSD. You really have to pair it with the therapeutic context. So like if you take MDMA in a social context, you're much more likely to be social. But, if you take it by yourself and sit on a couch, then you just want to melt into the couch.
So is the idea it has to be paired with the right kind of environment.
Right. And, recreational psychedelics users have known about this forever. They call it the set and setting, referring to the mindset and the situational setting. As a neuroscientist, I call that context. But what it suggested is that, it wasn't necessarily about the pro-social properties of MDMA, that there was something else going on. And so to test that idea, we compared this critical period reopening with a bunch of other drugs that were similar to MDMA. So first we looked at cocaine, which is also a psychostimulant. And cocaine did not reopen this critical period, which was really important to us because that suggested that this is really a critical period, that this is really reopening, and that it's not just about having a nice party and reminding the animals how much they like being with their peers, right? It's not about that. It's something else. So then we looked at other psychedelics. So we looked at ketamine, we looked at psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, we looked at LSD, we looked at ibogaine, which is a sort of unique psychedelic that comes from Africa. And we discovered that every single one of the psychedelics, whether they had any of those acute prosocial effects or not, reopened this critical period. So the take-home message is nobody's doing a 30-person cuddle puddle on LSD, and yet it was able to reopen this social critical period. And we've, subsequently discovered that, the context dependence also applies for ketamine. There's another group that has recently just shown, it's a paper up on bioRxiv, that psilocybin's effects are also, if you pair them with isolation, they fail to reopen the critical period.
And there's an association, isn't there, between the effect of the experience and the length of the effect of the critical period reopening?
Yeah. So that was another very cool sort of surprise to us. I think my intuition going into those experiments that it would be the intensity of the trip that determined whether or not the critical period was open and how long it was open. But instead, it turned out that it was the duration. So if you have a psychedelic that causes a very short trip, so imagine ketamine, it's 30 minutes to 2 hours max duration of the trip. And there, the critical period only stays open for about 48 hours. By 4 days, it's closed again. And on the other extreme, we have ibogaine, which the trip lasts, 36 to 72 hours. And now that drug is able to keep the critical period open for at least 4 weeks, but probably longer. And so that relationship between the open state of the critical period and the duration of the acute subjective effects, I think really convinced me that there's a mechanistic relationship between the trip and the opening of the critical period. And it also suggests that, what it feels like to be in that open state of the critical period is just what it feels like to be in the altered state of consciousness induced by psychedelics. This finding actually has a lot of, implications for how we implement psychedelics in a clinical setting. So the first is that, most of the clinical trials to date have really been focused on supporting the patients. During the trip, people are focused on, making sure that the patients feel safe, that they, have the therapeutic guidance to get them to explore their trauma and that they feel supported and able to do that. And then afterwards, there's some amount of emphasis on integration and keeping a journal and exploring your new insights. But the emphasis is really on the day of the trip, has been traditionally. But I think that our studies showing that, for example, MDMA keeps that critical period open for about 2 weeks after the trip really suggests that unless we are engaging with the patients during that time and really getting them to integrate and create new habits of behavior around their insights from the day of the trip, it's a missed therapeutic opportunity unless we're really focusing on that. At the same time, on the sort of flip side of that, it also is a caution because, I think that if you take people and you return them to this vulnerable juvenile state, and then you kind of put them back into their busy lives, or at worst, you expose them to, somebody who's going to be a bad influence on them, or who's their traumatizer, then you could make things worse. And so I think that we really do need to be more careful about the way we treat people after the trip is over, sort of in the same way as we would never, after somebody had a heart attack, send them home and tell them that they can go ahead and climb Mount Everest tomorrow. We're very careful and, ask that they recognize that the heart is in this very vulnerable state and that it's, susceptible to tearing in this recovery period, and that they really need to be, resting and not not allowing themselves to get stressed out too much while the heart muscles are being reconfigured and reconstituted.
I myself am in the still fairly early days of recovery from spine surgery a little more than a month ago. So they say, that 3 months, you've got to watch out. A lot has happened. So I know exactly what you mean. And so the cautionary note is probably useful. I mean, people could get overly excited about this and think, oh my God, I want to redo too, hard reboot. I'm having a hard time, but it might not have that expected outcome, especially in a sort of uncontrolled environment or without certain precautions and safety nets.
Yeah. So I would say that, we have a tendency to want to fix things quickly and be done with it. And especially if you are in pain, psychological pain is no different. You want that pain to go away as quickly as possible. But learning doesn't happen overnight, even for children in that natural open state of the critical period. And we need to be aware of the fact that, time matters, and that if we don't give people enough time to integrate their insights into their lives, then, the durability of the effects that we're most excited about, right? So, it's an opportunity to give people 3 medications and then have durable effects that last a year or longer, right? As opposed to the current standard of care, which is that you have to take pills for possibly the rest of your life. But I really think that the durability comes from what it is that you learn during the trip itself and in the weeks after the trip is over and you're still in that open state of the critical period.
Many psychiatric problems, just for example, are fairly long-term problems. That can be treated. I'm always sort of boosting the effectiveness of the things that we have. I want to keep doing that, but we're also treating here a lot of folks that have not necessarily benefited from the things that help a lot of people. So there's a lot of people who are still suffering with things, post-traumatic stress disorder, or things that happen in early childhood, especially tend to be longer-term things. So this is I would imagine for you, an exciting area of possibility in this arena. I sort of wonder, what are you most excited about in the future directions of research in this critical period area?
Yeah, so when I first started working on this, there was a little bit of skepticism in the field because it was like, people are saying psychedelics for everything, right? Like, what does PTSD have to do with addiction? What does addiction have to do with depression? What does all of that have to do with, how is it that one class of drugs, which seems to be working through different receptors, how are they all doing the same thing? And I think that there was some skepticism that this was just, placebo effects or wishful thinking on the part of the psychedelic community, that it was going to be so useful. And really, I think that the critical period explanation does a good job of accounting for this diversity of diseases, because if you think about it, every single one of them is a disorder that, has a learning component to it, right? We've learned some set of behaviors that was adaptive at the time of, say, if it was PTSD, was adaptive for during the moment to survive the injury, but over time are less and less adaptive. And so to be able to unlearn that is, the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, the critical period explanation really, I think, does a good job of that. What it also suggests is that there are a lot of other critical periods that are not kind of under the umbrella of psychiatry. So neurological diseases, there are plenty of neurological diseases that have learned components. And so what we are most excited about and what we're focused on next is motor learning following stroke. And so we have a clinical trial that is getting started soon, hopefully, that is going to be looking at people who had a stroke over a year ago, and their critical period is already closed. They're no longer getting benefit from physical therapy or occupational therapy. And so we want to go back for those patients, give them psychedelics. And this time, instead of pairing it with psychotherapy, we'll pair it with occupational therapy and sort of somatic techniques for preparation, and see if we can get them to that pairing to produce, rehabilitative benefits in terms of their motor learning.
That's so interesting. I mean, because the critical period reopening you've been talking about most has been this social reward learning critical period reopening, but that would be a different critical period entirely, right? So there's some hope that maybe this category of medicines broadly considered might open other critical periods also.
Yeah. So, I mean, my lab, we're really focused on social behavior, but I will say that since our 2019 paper describing this critical period idea first, there have been 3 other papers published showing that different psychedelics can reopen the ocular dominance critical period. I know 2 others that are, in progress that are looking at, the somatosensory critical period, and another one looking at the visual critical period. We have partnered with Steve Zeiler, who's a neurologist who's really, pioneered, developing a mouse model of motor learning after stroke. And so we're examining whether or not we can reopen those critical periods.
I'm going to tell you, that's one of the most exciting things I think I've ever heard about in medicine and development. I mean, am I getting it wrong? Should I be as excited as I feel for the state of the research?
Yeah,
here?
no, I think it is exciting, and I'm trying to spread the excitement, because I think that one of the things that happened last summer when the FDA failed to approve the drug application from Lykos, the company that was developing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, is that, the people on the scientific advisory committee to the FDA took one look at this data and they were like, this is too good to be true. You messed it up or you're cheating in some way. This can't be. You can't have an effect that is double the size of standard of care. That just doesn't happen in psychiatry. But see, for those of us who have been studying critical periods our whole lives and who, have been predicting that anything that could reopen them should be able to boost, these types of learning behaviors, doubling them. This was exactly the kind of result that we would expect. So I want to kind of impress upon people that this mechanism, if it ends up being the one that explains psychedelics effects, is predicted to have these massive effects and should generalize across a lot of different types of behaviors, and that's why neuroscientists have been obsessed with them for the last 100 years.
And sometimes, I know people are skeptical of things that seem too good to be true, but also if you look at the history of, discoveries in and out of medicine, I mean, they sometimes move forward in these kinds of leaps, many people involved, but all of a sudden there's penicillin, all of a sudden there's vaccines, all of a sudden there's, right? I mean, almost living memory, we have these things, right?
Right.
I mean, but so why not again,
Why not
right?
again? Yeah, I'm very excited about it. And I think that, those people who have used a lot of psychedelics, find that this explanation is very intuitive for the way that they have experienced it. But, that is not enough for me, because psychedelics in general have, a noetic property, and they are, very suggestible. And so if people have heard about this and then they experience psychedelics, they may be more inclined to interpret their experience through this lens because of what the drugs are doing. And so for me, the most gratifying part of it is getting this result in mice. The mice, they're sort of a natural double-blind placebo control, right? Like they
know precious little about Timothy
Yeah,
Leary or something, right?
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
They know
Yeah.
precious little
That's
about
right, yeah.
Timothy Leary. And so, to be able to get this objective measure and now to have several labs finding exactly the same thing for different critical periods that their expertise on, is very gratifying. But, I think that if we manage to show improvement in stroke, then that will be, a major leap forward, because I think it will shift the conversation, which is right now very much focused on, do we need therapy or do we not need therapy? And it's all about psychiatric illnesses. But if we can demonstrate it with stroke, where, in neurology, the notion of having therapy is already, very well established. Nobody would tell a person who has a stroke, sorry, we cleared your blood clot, but therapy's too expensive. You go on home. That would just never happen in neurology. And so I think that if we can demonstrate this principle, this proof of concept in a disease, a therapeutic setting where therapy is already well established as necessary and an important component of how you get recovery, then I think it will shift the conversation in a big way.
Well, Dr. Dolan, I've kept you from your research long enough and should maybe feel guilty about that.
No.
Maybe the state of the field is an hour behind now, but I'm grateful, and I think our listeners will be too. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, what a really interesting conversation. The idea that there could be these master keys that could unlock these critical periods that we once thought were closed forever could just have wide-ranging impacts in so many different fields.
I know, from stroke to mental health to who knows what else. I mean, I'm more excited about this kind of research than anything I've heard of in years. If this pans out, this is going to blow the lid off of a lot of science and could be really profoundly transformative. Really interesting, kind of amazing stuff. I just sort of kind of want to abide in that wonder of this possibility of where this very serious research might go.
Yeah. And she has a whole body of work, and her research is ongoing. So if you'd like to learn more about it, we've put a link in the show notes to the Dolan Lab.
Yeah, lots of wonderful information there, and there's some other interviews and things like that she's done. We can link to those. Some of them get into a lot more detail about the psychedelic angle of this and everything else. But I certainly am going to keep these critical periods in mind, and maybe I can one day get some sort of treatment. It'll make it easier for me to learn Italian. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
That would be great.
Yeah. I can almost hear her saying, "Don't hold your breath. We're working on stroke."
Right. It's more serious issues.
Unraveling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Atkin, Hans Buteau, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.